So in the last lesson, we looked at how we can start selecting out elements from our HTML page. Now we're going to look at alternative ways of selecting out elements. So we know when we're using CSS, we can select it by a class, we can select it by ID, we can select it by tag. So we also have the same capabilities when it comes to JavaScript and selecting out these elements. And this is why when you're creating HTML code, it is important to consider how you're going to use IDs, how you're going to use classes, and how you're going to identify elements that are going to need this interaction as well as need styling. So in this lesson, we're going to look at how we can get the My Buttons. And I'm going to select Document. And this time our method is going to be different. We're going to use Get Elements by Name. And we notice that this is plural, that elements is plural, because it's assumed that have multiple elements, and it's actually going to be get elements by class name, because we're going to be identifying them via the class name, and the identifying class name is btn. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to console log all of that information out, because the way that's going to be presented is going to be slightly different, because remember here we've got the possibility of having multiple items returned within this object, whereas when we're identifying it by ID, we know that we only have one ID per page of that particular value. So let's refresh our page. We'll open up and inspect and see what's coming up here in the console. And this will give us a better idea of what we have available to work with. So here we've got that HTML collection, and apparently we've got two items in that collection. So we've got a 0 and a 1. And we also have a btn1 and a btn2. So here it's identifying them via the ID, and here it's identifying them just as it would as ordered items within the object. So we've got our first item and our second item listed there. So when we open up these, again, we have that whole list of information there. So the question really is, how do we differentiate them and how do we break those out? So we can apply what we've learned before in JavaScript when it comes to accessing content, such as content from an array. And if we want to access, maybe we don't want to access the first one, but we want to access the second one, we can do something like this, where we're only looking at that second item in the collection, and we see here where we've got it identified there, and it's coming up the same way as the content from the get element by ID did, because we're already aware that we've got two items there when we look at our HTML code, and typically you want to keep this dynamic, so you don't want to hard code a number, but this is just for demonstration purposes, because I am aware that I do have two separate buttons here, a 0 and a 1, and this is how I'm accessing them. But typically you want to keep this dynamic enough so that if you do, you don't have to always count out all the different elements in order to be able to identify them. So another way when it comes to CSS to actually access a particular element is just using the tag name. So here, if we want to give access any one of the divs, and maybe we want to set a background color to them. So if we want to do this type of background color, we save it. We see that now all of those divs get that information. And we can in turn do the same thing with JavaScript, where we can access my tags. And this one is going to be document, because we're always accessing that document object. And remember, up here is where we've got a listing of all that document information that we have access to. And this just gives us a better idea to fine-tune our selection, where we're selecting and what we're selecting. So this one, again, this is going to be plural, and it's going to be get elements by tag name. And the tag that we're going to be selecting is going to be a div. And I'm going to do the same thing here where we console log out, and I'm going to console log out that entire object of tags. So when we refresh it, we see that we've got relatively that same thing that we had in the classes where we've got 3 items here within the collection, and then we can identify them separately and pick out whichever one we want to use. So for this case, I'm going to access that exact same one that we did in the My Buttons so that we have some consistency here on the output. So I'm going to access item number with an index of 1. So this is similar to arrays where it starts at 0, 1, 2. Refresh it, and we can see that now we're able to pull out that particular element and access it and update the content as needed via JavaScript. So every web page already has some default built-in information, and we can see all of this when we come here within our document object. So we see that we've got the URLs, we also have titles for the web page. So maybe this one isn't built in, but most web pages will define a title, so we can get access to there. So we can see that we literally have access to any one of these pieces of information about the web page, and once we have access to it, once we can identify it, then we can pick that out and manipulate it. So we're showing you more of this and how to pick out all of this default information that's already available within the web page that you can also utilize within your JavaScript. So we're going to be showing you that in the upcoming lesson.